The fog lay thick over Rue des Ombres, swallowing the gaslights whole and muffling the sound of footsteps. A single figure moved through the swirling grey, his boots striking the cobblestones with urgency. The alley, a narrow throat between crumbling brick tenements, was silent, save for the soft slosh of water dripping from unseen gutters. But at its dead end, something impossible had happened. Inspector Jules Renaud tightened his coat against the damp chill as he crouched beside the body sprawled in the alley. The corpse belonged to a man in his late 40s, dressed in a fine but rumpled suit, his shoes still gleaming despite the filth around him. His throat was slit cleanly, the blood already cooling in a dark pool beneath his head. The oddity, however, was the lack of any sign of struggle. No footprints in the surrounding grime except the victim's. No weapon, no witness. The fog should have swallowed any sound, but Renaud's instincts told him the crime had been swift, silent even. He studied the victim's outstretched hand, palm facing up, fingers curled as though he had been grasping at something. A single, puzzling clue lay nearby. A chess piece, a white knight, its smooth surface untouched by the grime of the alley. Renaud picked it up, turning it between his fingers. "A message or a mistake?" he murmured. Sergeant Moreau, his stout frame barely visible through the mist, exhaled loudly. "No sign of forced entry anywhere. The alley is a dead end, sir. The only way out is the street, and no one saw a soul leave." "No one?" Moreau shook his head. "Not a thing. The street is deserted this time of night. And with the fog," he gestured at the shifting, endless grey. "Anyone could have come and gone unseen." Renaud straightened, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding buildings. Old structures with shuttered windows, their facades crumbling with age. Yet something felt off. The body, the setting, it was too neat, too perfectly inexplicable. He turned his attention back to the victim. "Who is he?" "Name's Pierre Lemoine, wealthy banker, lives uptown, nowhere near here." Moreau hesitated. "One peculiar thing, his wallet's untouched, and there's a train ticket to Lyon in his pocket, for tomorrow morning." Renaud's brow furrowed. A man of Lemoine's stature had no reason to be in this part of town, let alone so late at night. And a train ticket suggested he had no intention of staying. Did he arrive alone? Moreau hesitated again. No idea, no witnesses, no witnesses, no sound, no struggle, a fog-drenched alley where a man bled out in perfect silence. And a chess piece. Renaud pocketed the night. The answers were out there, hidden in the mist. All he had to do was uncover them. The night pressed in, heavy with silence, as Inspector Jules Renaud stood motionless in the fog-drenched alley. The dicky chess piece, cool and smooth in his pocket, nagged at him like an unfinished puzzle. His keen eyes drifted across the body once more, then to the damp bricks lining the alley walls. No scuff marks, no sign of a struggle. It was as if Pierre Lemoine had walked here willingly, only to collapse where he now lay, his lifeblood seeping into the cracks between cobblestones. The crime had an eerie precision to it, a calculated neatness that felt unnatural. Moreau and the other officers busied themselves with the usual procedures, cordoning off the area, making notes, questioning what few onlookers had gathered at the alley's mouth. They would check Lemoine's known associates, dig into his financial dealings, follow the expected steps. But Renaud knew that kind of investigation would yield little. This was not a crime of passion, nor a simple robbery gone wrong. It was something else. He knelt again, his fingers tracing the ground near the body, pausing where the blood had pooled. The way it had spread was curious, too contained, as if Lemoyne had been killed precisely here in one swift motion. No streaks, no smudges, no evidence that he had staggered or fought. Renault's gaze flicked to the man's shoes. They were too clean. The streets leading to the alley were muddy from the earlier rain, yet the soles bore no trace of it. He stood abruptly, brushing dust from his trousers. "Moreau," he called, his voice cutting through the fog. "Are we certain Lemoyne walked here?" The sergeant, who had been jotting something in his notebook, looked up. "You mean—" Renault gestured to the victim's feet. "Look at his shoes. He didn't walk through these streets before arriving here." "He was brought," Moreau's brow furrowed. "That would mean the killer carried him?" "No," Renault said, his voice low. "It means he was placed here after death." Moreau let out a slow breath, his grip tightening on his notebook. "That makes no sense. Why go through the trouble?" Renault didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the alley's mouth, where an officer was speaking with a man wrapped in a threadbare coat, his hands trembling slightly. An old vagrant, Renault guessed. He walked over. The man looked up as Renault approached. His eyes, watery and unfocused, darted from the inspector to the corpse. "Didn't see nothing, I swear," he mumbled. Renault studied him carefully. The lines on the man's face suggested a life spent navigating the city's harsher edges, but there was something in his posture, something guarded. "You were here?" Renault said, not as a question but as a statement. "You heard something?" The man hesitated, then shook his head quickly. "Nah, just the fog's what I heard. Quiet as death." "Too quiet?" Renault asked. The vagrant licked his lips, glancing toward the officers before leaning in. "I don't know, sir. Ain't natural for it to be that quiet. But I heard something, a kind of click, like metal, just before you lot came." "That's all," Renault nodded. "A click. Something metallic, not a gunshot, not a struggle. Something small, precise. Did you see anyone?" The man shook his head again, more fervently this time. "Nothing. Just the fog." Renault slipped a few francs into the man's palm. "You'll let me know if you remember anything else." The man nodded, quickly pocketing the money before slinking back into the shadows. Moreau frowned. "A click? What do you make of that?" Renault didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the crime scene, his mind sorting through the details, the impossibly clean shoes, the too-perfect crime scene, the misplaced chess piece. It was too methodical, too constructed. This was not an impulsive killing. It was a move in a larger game, and somewhere in the fog the opponent was watching. The fog clung stubbornly to the alley, as if unwilling to release the secrets it held. Inspector Renault stepped away from the crime scene, leaving the officers to their tasks. The puzzle before him was delicate, each piece needing careful placement. He turned to Sergeant Moreau. "We need to speak with the people who knew Lemoyne. Start with his home, his business. Someone had a reason to silence him." Moreau nodded and gestured toward one of the officers. "Take care of the body. We're heading to Lemoyne's residence." The banker's home was on Rue Saint-Augustin, a refined townhouse with a manicured courtyard. The butler, a thin, grey-haired man with sunken cheeks, opened the door, his expression unreadable. "We require a word with Madame Lemoyne," Renault said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The butler hesitated only a moment before nodding and leading them to a drawing room. Madame Lemoyne sat stiffly on a velvet settee, hands folded in her lap. She was striking, high cheekbones, sharp blue eyes, but there was no grief on her face. Only a cold composure. When she spoke, her voice was level. "You're here about my husband." Renaud took a seat opposite her, studying her carefully. "I regret to inform you that he was found dead earlier this evening." A pause. A slight tilt of the head. No shock, no disbelief. Only a slow blink before she sighed. "How was murdered? In an alley." Madame Lemoine pursed her lips, exhaling through her nose. She was silent for a moment, then said, "I suppose I should be surprised, but I am not." Moreau, standing by the door, frowned. "You expected this?" She turned her gaze on him, cool and measured. "My husband made enemies. That is what happens in banking. He dealt with powerful men, and not all of them were honest." Renaud leaned forward slightly. "Would you happen to know why he had a train ticket to Lyon for tomorrow?" That made her blink twice. A flicker of something. Uncertainty? "Lyon?" she repeated. "I didn't know. He didn't tell me." Her reaction was controlled, but Renaud saw the way her fingers tightened against her skirts. She was lying. "Did your husband often keep secrets from you?" She smiled thinly. "Doesn't every man?" Moreau cleared his throat. "Was your husband acting strangely before today?" Madame Lemoine hesitated, just for a second. "He was restless. Distracted, perhaps. He took calls at odd hours, left suddenly without explanation." "Did he mention anyone by name?" Renaud pressed. "No. A single, simple answer. Too simple." "You don't seem particularly shaken by his death," Moreau said bluntly. She tilted her head. "Would you like me to weep, Sergeant? Would that convince you of my innocence?" Renaud watched her carefully. Her lack of grief was not proof of guilt, but it was something. She was controlling the conversation, revealing only what she wished them to see. "Where were you this evening, madame?" "In this house." "And your servants can confirm that?" She gave a small, humorless smile. "They can," Moreau sighed. "If you think of anything else, I won't," she said, rising from the settee. "Good evening, gentlemen." Outside, Moreau muttered, "She's hiding something." "She is," Renaud agreed. "But we need more than instinct." They headed next to Lemoine's office in the financial district. The building was dark at this hour, but the night watchman let them in after a few firm words from Moreau. The office was neat, the desk polished and free of clutter. A portrait of Lemoine hung behind it, his expression severe even in oil paint. The man who greeted them was Bernard Gautier, Lemoine's business partner. He was broad-shouldered, his suit slightly wrinkled as if he had been there for hours. He looked genuinely unsettled. This is horrible," Gautier murmured, rubbing his temple. "Pierre is dead?" "I'm afraid so," Renaud said. "When did you last see him?" "This afternoon. We had a meeting. He seemed anxious, preoccupied." "Did he say why?" "No, but he left early, said he had business to attend to." "What kind of business?" Gautier hesitated, then sighed. Pierre was cautious about certain dealings. He was moving money in ways that... He stopped himself. "In ways that what?" Renaud prompted. Gautier exhaled. "That some might find questionable." Moreau grunted. "Illegal, you mean?" "I didn't say that, but you implied it." Gautier pressed his lips together. "Look, Pierre was a good man, but he was playing a dangerous game. If he was killed, I wouldn't be surprised if it was over money." "Who would want him dead?" Gautier shook his head. "That I can't say." Renaud wasn't convinced. Gautier was nervous, but whether from grief or guilt he couldn't yet tell. He stood, offering a last glance at the office. It was too tidy, too perfect, just like the crime scene. Outside, Moreau muttered, "One too cold, one too nervous. Who do you trust? Renaud exhaled, feeling the weight of the chess piece in his pocket. Neither. The night had deepened by the time Renaud and Moreau left Lemoyne's office. The gaslights flickered in the damp air, their glow barely cutting through the fog that still clung to the city. The streets were quiet, but Renaud's mind was restless. 2 interviews, 2 contradictions. Madame Lemoyne's icy composure and Gautier's nervous energy both felt rehearsed in their own way. He had asked each about Lyon, and neither had given a convincing response. The chess piece in his pocket felt heavier now, a reminder that the crime was not merely about murder, but something more deliberate. A game. A move made in plain sight, waiting for a response. As they walked, Moreau exhaled through his nose. I don't like this. The wife barely flinches at her husband's death, and the business partner is sweating like a pig. They both have something to hide, Renaud nodded. And yet, neither explanation fits entirely. Lemoyne had a train ticket, which means he was leaving. His wife didn't know, or at least she pretended not to. Gautier claims Lemoyne was anxious, but he stopped short of admitting why. Moreau grumbled, rubbing his chin. Could be money, could be blackmail. You think Lemoyne was running? Perhaps. But from whom? A carriage rattled by, its wheels kicking up the dampness from the street. Renaud stopped at the curb, turning over the possibilities in his mind. There were motives, certainly, greed, revenge, fear, but none explained everything. Lemoyne had enemies in finance, that much was clear. A man like him did not reach wealth without stepping on a few fingers. But did someone in his professional life truly have reason to kill him in such a calculated manner? And then there was the personal aspect. Madame Lemoyne, so poised, too poised. Had she known of her husband's dealings? Had she cared? He motioned for Moreau to follow. One more stop. The address they sought was in a less refined part of town, near the docks, a quiet boarding house with peeling paint and warped shutters. They knocked, and after a moment, an elderly landlady peered through the door. Inspector Renaud, he said smoothly. We're looking for Henri Dubois. The woman pursed her lips. Gone. Gone. Left a few hours ago. Packed in. A hurry. Renaud and Moreau exchanged a glance. Did he say where? She shook her head. Didn't say a word, just left money for the room and walked out with a case. Renaud felt a prick of certainty. Was he expecting trouble? The landlady sniffed. He looked over his shoulder twice before stepping out the door. You tell me. Henri Dubois was a name Renaud had come across before. A fixer of sorts, a man who dealt in information, often for a price. If Lemoyne had been in trouble, Dubois might have known why, and now he was gone. Back in the street, Moreau exhaled sharply. That's too much of a coincidence. Lemoyne is murdered, and Dubois disappears the same night. Renaud's fingers curled around the chess piece in his pocket. No coincidence. Someone is erasing their tracks. They needed to move quickly. If Dubois had fled, it was because he feared something or someone, and that meant he was still alive, at least for now. Renaud knew that the next step would be finding him before the killer did. The night stretched long as Renaud and Moreau moved through the damp streets, their breath forming pale ghosts in the cold air. The disappearance of Henri Dubois shifted the entire investigation. Whoever had killed Pierre Lemoyne wasn't content with just one loose end. They were tying up every thread, making sure no one could speak. That meant Dubois knew something worth silencing. As they neared the station, a young officer hurried toward them, his boots slapping against the wet cobblestones. He was breathless, his face flushed with urgency. "Inspector, we got him!" Renaud arched a brow. "Got who?" The officer swallowed hard, glancing between him and Moreau. A man was caught near the Gare de Lyon, carrying a bloodied knife. He was trying to board a train. Matches the description of Henri Dubois. Moreau let out a low whistle. That was fast, tout fast, Renaud thought. The pieces weren't adding up. A man like Dubois, someone who made his living in secrets, wouldn't be foolish enough to be caught so easily, certainly not carrying the murder weapon. The timing was too convenient. Still he said nothing and motioned for the officer to lead them to the suspect. At the station, Dubois sat slumped in a wooden chair, his wrists bound with iron cuffs. He was a wiry man, his unshaven face and hollow cheeks making him look older than he was. He eyed Renaud with a mix of defiance and resignation. On the table in front of him, a long, slender knife lay wrapped in a cloth. A stain of deep crimson marked the blade's edge. Moreau crossed his arms. "So, Dubois, running for the train with a bloody knife in your pocket. That's not the best look for an innocent man." Dubois gave a dry chuckle. "Since when does innocence have anything to do with looks?" Renaud leaned forward. "You were leaving the city." "That's right. With a weapon that appears to have Pierre Lemoine's blood on it." Dubois shrugged. "So it appears," Renaud studied him. There was something off about the way Dubois held himself, too relaxed, too indifferent. A man truly caught in such circumstances would be scrambling for excuses, desperate to explain. Instead, Dubois was acting like a man who had already accepted his fate. Moreau exhaled. "The case doesn't get much clearer than this, Inspector." But it did. That was the problem. It was too clean, too simple. A man caught red-handed with the murder weapon just hours after the crime. If the real killer had been so careless, Lemoine would have never lived long enough to be a problem in the first place. Renaud sat down across from Dubois, his eyes sharp. "Tell me, how did you kill him?" Dubois tilted his head. "I imagine you've already made up your mind about that. I want to hear it from you." Dubois chuckled again, shaking his head. "You think this is real, don't you? You think I actually did it?" He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "I've been in this city long enough to know when I'm being used. Someone wanted you to find me. Someone made sure I'd be caught." Renaud remained silent. That was what he had suspected. Dubois had been placed into this role like a pawn moved forward on a chessboard. But who had set the play in motion? Footsteps echoed in the hallway before the door swung open. The police commissioner entered, his expression a mask of satisfaction. "Inspector, excellent work." Renaud didn't move. "Sir?" "The evidence is clear. Dubois was found with the weapon, attempting to flee. His connection to Lemoine's business dealings is well documented. There's no need to drag this out further." The commissioner turned to the officers standing by the door. "Prepare his transfer. He'll face trial immediately." Dubois let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." The commissioner ignored him. Moreau hesitated, but ultimately nodded. "It does look clear, Renaud." But clarity was often an illusion. Renaud watched as Dubois was hauled to his feet, the man still smirking. Despite the chains around his wrists, there was no desperation, no pleas for innocence. He wasn't acting like a man who feared the noose. He was acting like a man who knew something no one else did. As the door swung shut, Renaud tapped his fingers against the table. The chess piece in his pocket pressed against his leg like a warning. This wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. Renaud stood in the quiet of his office, the gaslight flickering against the damp air that seeped through the window pane. Outside, the city pulsed, with the muffled sounds of carriages and footsteps, life continuing as if Pierre Lemoine's death meant nothing. Yet something gnawed at him. The case had wrapped itself up too neatly, too quickly. Dubois had practically been delivered to them, and now, within hours, he was already being processed for trial. Moreau had left for the evening, content with the so-called resolution, but Renaud remained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the chess piece once more, turning it between his fingers. A white knight. It wasn't random. Someone had left it on Lemoine's body, a message rather than an accident. Chess was a game of strategy, of moves played in advance. He pulled out Lemoine's file and spread the contents across his desk. Business dealings, past associates, financial reports. The man had no shortage of enemies, but what if the answer wasn't in the present at all? He flipped through until he found something that made him pause. A name, Jean-Luc Martel. A man whose name hadn't been spoken in years. Renaud sat back, the weight of memory pressing down on him. Martel had been a banker, much like Lemoine, but he had vanished a decade ago. His disappearance had been the talk of Paris for months, though no body had ever been found. It was assumed he had fled, leaving behind debts and ruined partners, including a young, ambitious financier named Pierre Lemoine. His fingers traced the old report, yellowed with age. If Martel had been running, it was from something or someone. And now, years later, Lemoine was dead. The connection was too strong to ignore. Renaud rose abruptly, slipping the chess piece back into his pocket. He needed to speak to someone who remembered that time, someone who had been close to Martel. The answer led him to the one person he had been avoiding. Madame Lemoine's estate was dark when he arrived, save for a single window glowing with candlelight. He knocked firmly, and after a long moment the door opened to reveal her, wrapped in a dark shawl, her eyes unreadable. "Inspector," she murmured, "you do keep late hours." "So do you, madame." She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in, then." The parlour was draped in shadows, the candlelight flickering against the marble hearth. Renaud remained standing. "Tell me about Jean-Luc Martel." The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight intake of breath, the tightening of her fingers against the folds of her shawl. "I haven't heard that name in years. But you remember it?" Her gaze was steady, but something in it had changed. "He was my husband's mentor, a brilliant man, and then one day he disappeared." "Did he?" Renaud watched her closely. Or was he silenced? Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. Then slowly she said, "Pierre never spoke." "Of it. But after Martel vanished, everything changed. He became cautious, private, even with me. He took Martel's place, didn't he? In business, in reputation?" She exhaled, her posture stiff. "Yes, but that wasn't all. There was a debt, Inspector. A debt Pierre never spoke of, but one I knew hung over him." Renaud's pulse quickened. "A debt to whom?" She hesitated, then quietly, "To the man who made Martel disappear." A name hovered in the air between them, unspoken. Lemoine hadn't been killed over money alone. He had been playing a game that had begun long before his death, one that had started the moment Martel vanished. And now the past was coming back, for everyone. Renaud left the Lemoine estate with his coat pulled tight against the cold, but it wasn't the wind that sent a chill through him. A debt Pierre Lemoine had never spoken of, a shadow from the past still reaching into the present. If Martel had disappeared because of this debt, and now Lemoine had followed, the pattern was clear. Someone was erasing old transactions. He turned onto the quiet streets, his mind pulling apart the pieces. Dubois had been placed in their hands like a sacrificial offering, but he wasn't the architect. Lemoine's murder wasn't an act of sudden passion. It was a move played long ago, calculated and precise. The chess piece in his pocket pressed against his palm. A white knight, he needed to force the real player to reveal themselves. Instead of returning to the station, he made his way to the Café Voltaire, a dimly lit establishment known for late-night dealings and quiet conversations. The owner, a wiry man named Gautier, barely glanced up from wiping down the bar. "I was wondering when you'd show," Gautier murmured as Renaud settled into a seat. "You knew I was coming?" "You've been hunting ghosts, Inspector." "Ghosts always lead here." Renaud placed the chess piece on the table between them. "Tell me about this." Gautier's hand hesitated in its movement just for a fraction of a second before he continued wiping the glass. "Chess, is it? Not just any chess, the kind played in back rooms and locked offices." "I know what it means, Gautier," the cafe owner sighed, setting the glass down. "I don't know who left it for you, but I can tell you this. When Martel was still around, he used to play with a man they called the banker, not Lemoine, someone older, a man who never lost." Renaud leaned in. "A man who collects debts?" Gautier gave him a long look. "A man who makes sure no one forgets them." A name formed at the edge of Renaud's thoughts, but it remained elusive. He needed confirmation. He needed a reaction. A plan took shape. The next morning, Renaud stood before a cell door in the holding cells beneath the police station. Inside, Henri Dubois lounged on the bench, hands folded behind his head. He looked up with an arched brow as Renaud stepped inside. "Back already?" Dubois smirked. "I was starting to think you'd let me rot." Renaud pulled a chair closer and sat down. "I wanted to thank you," Dubois blinked. "Thank me? For leading me to the real killer?" Renaud leaned forward, his voice smooth. "You see, I finally understand. You're just another piece on the board, Dubois. A pawn." Dubois stiffened slightly, the first crack in his carefully constructed mask. Renaud continued. "The game was played long before you ever stepped into it. Martel vanished, but his debt remained. Lemoine took his place, and when it came time to settle accounts, he paid the same way." He let the silence stretch. "And now you're here, conveniently placed, like a piece sacrificed to keep the king safe." Dubois' jaw tightened. Renaud stood. "I suppose it doesn't matter. The real player will slip up soon enough. A man like that, he never likes to lose." He turned, as if to leave, then paused. "Funny, though. When I mentioned this to Gautier, he said Martel always played white." He pulled the chess piece from his pocket, letting the light catch it. "And this knight? It doesn't belong to him." Dubois was silent, but his breathing had changed. Renaud gave a slight nod. He had his answer. Someone else had been at the board. Someone who didn't just play the game, someone who controlled it. As Renaud left the holding cells, the air in the corridors felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the secrets he was chasing. He had seen the flicker in Dubois' expression, the tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze had darted for just a second toward the chess piece. It was confirmation. Dubois wasn't acting alone. Someone was moving pieces in the background, ensuring that Lemoyne's murder was wrapped up quickly and cleanly. But a true mastermind never let the board remain unsettled for long. The feeling of being watched trailed Renaud as he stepped into his office, the faint scent of burnt tobacco lingering in the air. Someone had been here. His desk, though outwardly undisturbed, felt wrong. The papers he had left in a neat stack before visiting Dubois were no longer perfectly aligned. He reached for the case file on Lemoyne's murder and flipped it open. His fingers froze. The chess piece was gone. He felt his pulse quicken. No one but a handful of people had known he had it. He searched through the papers, but nothing else seemed missing. No files, no reports. Just the one item that could confirm his growing suspicions. It hadn't been a random clue. It had been bait. And now someone had taken it back. Renaud closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Someone inside the station was working against him. A knock at the door made him straighten. Moreau stepped inside, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. Dubois' lawyer just arrived. Says he won't be answering any more questions. Renaud exhaled. Of course he won't. He studied Moreau for a beat. Did anyone enter my office while I was downstairs? Moreau frowned. Not that I saw. Why? Renaud didn't answer. He stood, grabbed his coat, and motioned for Moreau to follow. We need to move before this case is completely buried. They left the station, making their way toward the one person Renaud suspected could still give them an answer before it was too late. Madame Lemoine. The streets were slick with mist as they reached the Lemoine estate. Renaud knocked, but there was no answer. A sense of unease prickled at him. He knocked again, harder this time. Nothing. Moreau glanced at him, then tried the door. It creaked open. Inside, the house was eerily silent. The air carried a faint trace of something metallic, blood. They stepped into the parlour, and there, crumpled near the hearth, was Madame Lemoine. Renaud rushed forward, kneeling beside her. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow. A bruise was forming on her temple, and near her outstretched hand lay a single, unmistakable object. A black knight, Moreau swore under his breath. Whoever did this didn't come to kill her, Renaud said quietly. They came for information. He looked around, scanning the room. Papers had been pulled from drawers, overturned furniture showing signs of a search. And then he saw it. Near the desk, a small, broken lockbox. He pulled it open. Empty. The missing piece, Moreau muttered. Whatever she had, they took it. Renaud felt the weight of the stolen chess piece in his mind, the vanishing evidence stacking against him. Someone wasn't just cleaning up the crime. They were making sure the truth was never found. Renaud felt the weight of urgency pressing down on him. Madame Lemoine's shallow breathing was the only indication that she was still alive. Whoever had done this hadn't intended to kill her, at least not yet. They had wanted something, and judging by the empty lockbox, they had found it. The question was what? Moreau was already calling for an ambulance, his voice tight with barely concealed anger. Renaud stood, his eyes scanning the ransacked room for anything that might have been overlooked. His mind worked through the sequence of events. If Madame Lemoine had been attacked, it meant she had known something valuable, something worth silencing her for. He moved toward the fireplace where the black knight lay just inches from her limp fingers. It was a message, just like the white knight before it. Someone was still playing the game. Then a thought struck him. If the attacker had searched the house, taken whatever was in the lockbox, and left her alive, It meant they were in a hurry, which meant they weren't finished yet. A sharp noise outside made Renault's pulse jump, a car engine turning over. Without thinking, he bolted toward the door, nearly knocking into Moreau as he rushed out onto the fog-covered street. The tail lights of a dark sedan flickered as the vehicle sped off into the night. Renault ran for his own car, but by the time he reached it, the sedan had vanished into the maze of streets. Cursing under his breath, he slammed a hand against the roof of the car. Moreau jogged up behind him. "Did you see who it was?" "No." Renault exhaled, rubbing his temple. "But we need to find out what was in that lockbox, and fast." Moreau hesitated. "You think they'll strike again?" Renault looked back at the house, where Madame Lemoine lay unconscious. They wouldn't have left her alive if they weren't planning something worse. The ambulance arrived moments later, and Madame Lemoine was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. The paramedics assured Renault she would survive, but it would be hours before she regained consciousness. Time they didn't have as they drove back. Toward the station, Renault replayed everything in his mind. Dubois had reacted when he saw the White Knight. Now, with the Black Knight left behind, the pattern was undeniable. A chessboard with missing pieces, an unseen player eliminating threats one by one. Then his phone rang. He answered without hesitation. Renault. A pause, then a low, controlled voice. "You're too late, Inspector." Renault sat up straight. "Who is this?" "You're chasing." "A ghost. But ghosts have ways of keeping secrets buried." A slight pause. "Checkmate." The line went dead. A deep, sinking feeling settled in Renault's gut. He turned to Moreau. "Turn the car around." Moreau frowned. "Where?" "The station." Something was happening. Right now, and if they didn't move fast, the next piece on the board wouldn't just be removed, it would be destroyed. Renault's pulse quickened as Moreau swerved the car toward the station, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The words from the unknown caller echoed in his mind. Checkmate. It wasn't a threat, it was a declaration. Something was happening, something that would cement the villain's advantage if he didn't act now. The station came into view, looming against the fog like a fortress. The moment the car skidded to a stop, Renault was out, pushing through the entrance. Officers milled about, but there was an energy in the air, a shift he felt in his bones. L'évêque. He barked at a junior officer who startled at his tone. "Anything unusual in the last 15 minutes?" L'évêque hesitated. Yes, sir. There was a break-in. Someone got into the evidence room." Renault didn't wait for more. He stormed. Through the halls, Moreau on his heels. The evidence room door stood slightly ajar, the lock twisted and useless. Inside, cabinets had been yanked open, folders thrown to the floor in a chaotic mess. He scanned the room quickly. "What's missing?" The officer on duty, pale and visibly shaken, stammered, "The chess piece, sir. The one you found at the crime scene." Renault's jaw tightened. The White Knight. Gone. Moreau exhaled sharply. "They're erasing every piece of proof." Renault's gaze swept over the disarray. If the intruder had only wanted the chess piece, they wouldn't have ransacked everything. They had been searching for something else, something they weren't sure where to find. And then, suddenly, he saw it. A subtle detail amidst the chaos. Among the scattered files lay one that hadn't belonged to this case. A name printed on the cover sent a jolt through his spine. Lemoine, Bernard, Renault bent down, flipping it open. It was an old case, years old, detailing fraud allegations against Bernard Lemoine before the charges had been mysteriously dropped. It clicked. The game had never been about a single murder. It had never been about Dubois or even about Madame
Lemoine's attack. This went deeper, farther back than anyone had considered. Moreau peered over his shoulder. "That's Lemoine's father, isn't it?" "Yes," Renaud murmured. "And this case file?" He trailed off, piecing together
the implications. Someone made sure Bernard Lemoine's crimes disappeared. Someone powerful. Moreau frowned. And now his son turns up dead. You think it's connected? Renaud's mind raced. An old scandal, a family secret, a pattern of destruction to keep it buried. The pieces had always been in plain sight. The chess set, the careful staging, the methodical erasure of evidence. Someone wasn't covering up a murder. They were ensuring that a past crime stayed forgotten. The real question was, who was left on the board? Renaud stared at the file in his hands, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Bernard Lemoine, father of the murdered man entangled in fraud, that had mysteriously disappeared. Someone had buried that case years ago, and now someone was killing to keep it that way. Moreau shifted beside him. If Bernard's scandal was covered up, someone had to have done it for him. A benefactor, someone powerful, Renaud nodded slowly, or someone with a personal stake. He flipped through the pages, scanning the details. Transactions, signatures, a name. There. His breath caught. Moreau frowned. What is it? Renaud tapped his finger against a signature at the bottom of a key document. Gérard Favre. Moreau's eyebrows shot up. The judge. Not just any judge, Renaud muttered. The same judge who presided over Bernard Lemoine's fraud case before it was dismissed. The same judge who had dealings with Dubois, who oversaw cases that mysteriously vanished, and the same judge who just happened to be retiring next week. Moreau exhaled sharply. You think he's behind all this? I think he was once. But this
is different. Renaud set the file down, his mind sharpening around the truth. This isn't about covering up a single fraud case. This is about control, about corruption. Moreau stiffened. You think someone's trying to erase his legacy? Or
force his hand before he steps down, Renaud corrected. Dubois was part of something, Bernard Lemoine was part of something, and now someone is tying up loose ends before it all comes crashing down. A chilling thought settled in his mind. The meticulous planning, the use of chess pieces as markers, it wasn't just about who had to die, it was about why. Control. Each murder had removed someone with a link to the past, but it wasn't just to silence them, it was to make a statement. Moreau shifted uneasily. So who benefits from this? Who's behind it? Renaud thought about the voice on the phone, the eerie calm, the certainty. Someone who wasn't just covering up crimes, someone who was orchestrating a perfect ending, and there was only one move left to play. Renaud stood in the judge's study, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders like an iron shroud. The heavy oak desk between them was covered in neatly stacked papers, an ordered contrast to the chaos of the past days. Judge Gérard Favre regarded him with an expression of calm indifference, his wrinkled hands folded neatly before him. You came all this way, Inspector, Favre said, his voice smooth, unshaken. I assume you have something more than speculation. Renaud's fingers brushed the inside of his coat, feeling the comforting weight of the recorder. The game was at its final stage. Every move had led here. Not speculation, he said evenly. Truth. You buried Bernard Lemoine's fraud case, ensured it never saw the light of day. But he wasn't the only one you protected, was he? There were others. Dubois knew, and he threatened to reveal it. Favre gave the slightest tilt of his head, the ghost of a smile on his lips. If Dubois had information, why would I kill him? That would only bring more attention to me, wouldn't it? You didn't kill him, Renaud said, watching the judge's reaction carefully. But someone else did. Someone who had more to lose. Favre's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened just slightly, the only betrayal of emotion. Renaud continued. Bernard Lemoine's death wasn't just a murder, it was a message. Someone wanted him gone before he could talk. Someone who understood the game as well as you do. And someone who wasn't afraid to make their move before you could.
Act.
Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, for the first time, Favre exhaled deeply, as if shedding a weight he had carried for far too long. "You're too late, Inspector," he said, his voice almost weary. "This isn't about
me anymore." Renaud's stomach tightened. He had been prepared for denials, for resistance. But not this. "What do you mean?" he pressed. Favre leaned back in his chair, regarding him with something almost akin to pity. "You think you've reached
the end of the game, but you were only ever watching the board, never the hands that moved the pieces." A chill ran down Renaud's spine. The judge wasn't the mastermind. He had been a pawn, one who had lost his usefulness. And then, as if on cue, the phone on Favre's desk rang, a single sharp sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Favre didn't move to answer it. He simply looked at Renaud, his lips curling into something between amusement and regret. "The final move has already been made, Inspector," he murmured. "Checkmate," the phone rang again, its shrill tone slicing through. The heavy silence in the judge's study. Favre remained motionless, his eyes locked on Renaud's with something unsettlingly close to resignation. Renaud reached for the receiver before the judge could, lifting it to his ear. "Renaud." A moment of silence. Then a voice, smooth, measured. "You were always so close, Inspector. Closer than you realized." A faint click. The line went dead. Renaud tightened his grip on the receiver, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned back to Favre, who was watching him with quiet amusement. "Who was that?" Favre merely exhaled. "The one who truly matters." Renaud clenched his jaw. This wasn't over. The judge wasn't the king on the chessboard. He was another sacrificed piece, and the true mastermind had just made their presence known. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement beyond the window. The street below, cloaked in fog, distorted the shapes of figures passing by. But there, near the lamppost, a figure stood too still, too calculated. A presence that didn't belong. Renaud moved before he could think, wrenching the door open and taking the stairs two at a time. Moreau barely had time to call after him before he was outside, stepping into the damp night air. The figure turned at his approach, slow and deliberate, and as they did, Renaud's stomach twisted into a knot. It was someone he never would have suspected. A face he had seen countless times in passing, a voice he had heard in the background of this very case, someone who had never been truly under suspicion because they had blended too well. Commissioner Alain Mercier. Mercier gave him an almost rueful smile.
"Ah, Inspector, I was hoping you wouldn't be so quick." Renaud's mind raced, piecing it together in an instant. Mercier had been there since the beginning. The murders, the cover-ups, it all led back to someone with the power to manipulate.
The case from the inside, someone who had orchestrated every misdirection, every disappearance of evidence. Mercier's voice remained infuriatingly calm. You were right about Favre, of course. He was an old man clinging to power he didn't deserve. But this was never about him. It was about keeping the system intact, keeping the right people
in control. Renault's fists clenched. You killed for that? Mercier gave a small, almost regretful nod. And I'd do it again. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then Mercier moved. A flicker of motion, a hand
dipping into his coat. Renault reacted on instinct, drawing his own weapon. Don't. Mercier hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then he exhaled, withdrawing his hand. Not a gun. A cigarette case. He flicked it open, took out a single cigarette, and lit it with infuriating nonchalance. You've won, Inspector, Mercier said quietly. For now. Renault didn't lower his weapon. Not yet. Because even as Mercier admitted defeat, something in his tone told him this wasn't truly over. Renault's grip on the revolver remained firm, his finger resting against the trigger. As he watched Mercier exhale a slow stream of smoke into the fog, the street was eerily silent, as if the city itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. You already know how this ends, Mercier said, rolling the cigarette between his fingers. You can arrest me, you can put me on trial, but do you think that will change anything? Renault's jaw tightened. That's not for you to decide, Mercier chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. You still don't see it, do you? This wasn't just about one crime. It wasn't just about Favre or the others. It was about control. Keeping order where chaos threatens to seep in. Renault took a step closer. You justify it however you want. It doesn't change the fact that you're a murderer. Mercier flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his heel.
And yet, Inspector, you needed me. If I hadn't led you through this game, if I hadn't left you just enough breadcrumbs, you'd still be chasing shadows. The arrogance in his voice made Renault's blood boil. Mercier had toyed with them.
All manipulated the investigation from within, steering it just enough to mislead without ever fully losing control.
And yet in the end, he had miscalculated. You slipped, Renault said. You had to cover Favre's tracks too quickly. You underestimated how many people wanted him gone, and when you tried to tie up the last loose ends, you left your own fingerprints behind. Mercier's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. Renault continued.
The missing file in the archives wasn't just an oversight, it was removed in a hurry. And the way the body was staged, it was meant to look like one of Favre's rivals had done it. But only someone with inside knowledge could have arranged it so precisely you thought you were erasing mistakes, but you were leaving a pattern. Mercier gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And now you have me. Renault took out his handcuffs. Turn around. For the first time, Mercier hesitated. His gaze flickered down the street, as if calculating something. Then, just as quickly, his expression smoothed over again. Very well, he said, and turned. Renault snapped the cuffs onto his wrists, pulling them tight. Moreau and two uniformed officers approached from the end of the street, their footsteps echoing against the damp cobblestones. Take him in, Renault said. Moreau nodded, gripping Mercier by the arm and leading him toward the waiting car. As he was guided inside, Mercier glanced back over his shoulder, meeting Renault's gaze one last time. There was no panic, no desperation, just the same calm, knowing smirk. A shiver ran down Renault's spine. Mercier wasn't afraid. As the car door slammed shut and the engine rumbled to life, a thought struck Renault like a fist to the chest. Mercier had planned for this. Renault turned to Moreau. Get to the station. Now, Moreau frowned. He's already in custody. Exactly. Renaud started walking, then running. That's the problem. By the time he arrived at the station, the tension in his chest had knotted into something worse than dread. Mercier sat calmly in the holding cell, his hands still cuffed, his expression one of quiet amusement. He barely looked up as Renaud entered. "You're fast, Inspector," Mercier murmured. "But you were always just a step behind." Renaud's eyes flickered to the desk sergeant, whose expression was tight with unease. "There's been a call," the sergeant said quietly. "A lawyer. High level. Orders from above." Renaud already knew what was coming before the words were even spoken. They're letting him go. The rage that burned in Renaud's chest was ice cold. He stared at Mercier, who merely leaned back.
"Against the wall, utterly composed. This city protects its own," Mercier said smoothly.
"And you, my dear Inspector, are not one of them." The next few minutes passed in a blur. A signed document, a quiet conversation behind closed doors, Mercier stepping out of the cell, straightening his coat with infuriating ease. And then he was walking past Renaud, pausing only long enough to offer a final measured glance. "I would have made you an offer once," he said, "but you're too honest. It's going to cost you." Then he was gone. The night air outside was thick with the scent of rain, but Renaud barely noticed. He stood in the doorway of the station, watching as Mercier stepped into a black car waiting at the curb. The driver, another faceless piece of the system, closed the door behind him, and just like that, Mercier disappeared into the night. Renaud exhaled slowly. He had won the battle. But the war, that was far from over. Renaud remained at the station's entrance long after Mercier's car had vanished into the wet, gleaming streets. The city hummed around him, distant engines, muffled laughter from a late-night bar, the whisper of rain against pavement, but he barely heard any of it. His mind kept replaying those final moments, Mercier's calm, almost amused expression as he walked free. The system had spoken, and it had chosen to protect one of its own. A gust of wind sent a discarded newspaper skidding across the sidewalk. Renaud glanced down, catching the blurred headline, "Corruption allegations dismissed, justice prevails, says prosecutor." He let out a breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Justice, a convenient illusion maintained by the powerful and the willing. Moreau stepped up beside him, hands stuffed into his pockets, his jaw tight with frustration. "We did everything right," he muttered. "We had him, Renaud." "We had enough," Renaud corrected, "but not more than his friends." Moreau exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "So what now?" Renaud didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back toward the station, his gaze flickering to the hallway leading toward the evidence room. Something gnawed at him, a quiet, persistent itch in the back of his mind. Not just anger, not just the sting of defeat. A detail, small, but off he started walking. Moreau followed without question. The evidence log sat open on the desk, the last few entries marked with precise, bureaucratic handwriting. Renaud's finger traced down the list until he found what he was looking for. Item 312B, leather-bound, notebook. Retrieved from suspect's personal effects. He tapped the entry. Did anyone actually look through this? Moreau frowned. That was Mercier's, right? We logged it, but the order came down to return all personal items when they cut him loose. A slow, cold realization crept over Renaud's skin. He didn't have a notebook when he walked out. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Moreau swore under his breath. "Someone took it!" Renaud didn't hesitate. He pushed through the station, his steps quick and precise, heading toward the evidence locker. The officer on duty barely had time to react before Renaud was flipping through the remaining items, checking tags, scanning for anything that might
have been misplaced. Nothing. The notebook was gone. He stepped back, exhaling slowly. Mercier had walked free, yes, but before he had, someone had made sure a specific piece of evidence vanished. That meant something. You think there was something in it? Moreau asked, voice low. Renaud's mind raced through possibilities.
If the notebook had simply been a collection of Mercier's musings, his contacts, his coded transactions, it wouldn't have mattered. He had people powerful enough to make sure none of it ever saw daylight. But if someone inside the system
had wanted it gone before he even left the station. It wasn't his secrets they were protecting, Renaud said slowly. It was someone else's.
Moreau gave him a sharp look. "You think Mercier was covering for someone higher up?" "I think Mercier was a player in the game," Renaud murmured. "Not the one calling the shots." The thought was unsettling. Mercier had been brilliant, ruthless, untouchable, or so it had seemed, but even he had shown restraint. He had let himself be caught, allowed the game to play out just enough to mislead them, because in the end he hadn't been worried, because he had never truly been in control. Moreau ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "So we just let this go? We chalk it up to another case where the real answers get buried?" Renaud closed the evidence logbook, staring at the desk for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "We watch." Moreau frowned. "Watch what?" Renaud's fingers tapped once against the wooden surface. "Mercier played his part in this, but someone else made sure we didn't see the full picture. People like that, they don't stop just because one case is over. They get comfortable. They think they're safe." He glanced at Moreau. "And when people think they're safe, they make mistakes." Understanding dawned in Moreau's expression. "You're saying we wait for the next crack in the armor?" "We don't wait," Renaud corrected. "We look." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unfinished business pressing between them. The case had closed, at least on paper. Mercier was free. The city had gone back to pretending nothing had ever happened. But Renaud knew better. A mystery never truly ended. It just changed form, shifted into something new, waiting for the right
moment to unravel, and when that moment came, he would be ready.